A year ago, I actually gave a talk about what was our new book at the time, The Madhouse Effect, How Climate Change Denial is Threatening Our Planet, Destroying Our Politics, and Driving Us Crazy. My co-author is Tom Toll. Some of you may know him as the editorial cartoonist for the Washington Post. But what you may not know is that he actually did some of the early illustrations and cartoons for a CSI publication back when he was in Buffalo in his earlier years. So he's part of the CSI family, in fact. And he has been engaged in some of the hardest-hitting commentary in our mainstream media when it comes to climate change and climate change denial. Now, of course, we had no idea when we published this more than a year ago of what would happen in the following months. Some would say that perhaps this book was quite prescient. After all, trying to communicate science through cartoons is one way we might actually be able to reach our chief executive today. So we did try that. It doesn't seem to have worked. So I've aimed a little lower now. This is my latest effort. The Tantrum That Saved the World. It is a children's book about climate change. It has a target audience of 5 to 10 years old, so we think that might actually be better aimed at our current White House occupant. We'll see if that makes a difference. We are very proud of the fact we're halfway through our fundraising campaign. We've got a Kickstarter campaign to produce this book. We're very excited that we were attacked by Breitbart News already, and so we certainly wear that as a badge of honor. Well, so we are in the madhouse in a way that we couldn't have imagined a year ago. Climate change denial is, of course, the official policy of our president. And it's worth sort of revisiting, how we got here. This is an audience, of course, that embraces skepticism. We recognize how important skepticism is in science. As Carl Sagan termed it, it's the self-correcting machinery of science. But all too often, and Steve Novella gave a really nice presentation, lunch presentation about this. Too often today, we allow the forces of pseudoscience and anti-science to dress up as if they're skeptics when they're nothing of the sort, rejecting mainstream science based on the flimsiest of arguments that don't hold up to the slightest bit of scrutiny. That's not skepticism. Well, Carl Sagan also said that the fact that some geniuses were laughed at does not imply that all who are laughed at are geniuses. They laughed at Columbus, they laughed at Fulton, they laughed at the Wright brothers, but they also laughed at Bozo the Clown. And for every Galileo, there are thousands of Bozo the Clowns, and too often today they have the megaphone. And in fact, every seat at the table of the Oval Office, including the president's seat today. So we face that challenge. We also face the challenge of false balance. Now, I like to remind people that when it comes to fake news and alternative facts, this may be new in the American lexicon, but we've been dealing with this for years when it comes to climate change denial. And too often, when it comes to coverage of issues like climate science in our mainstream media, there is this need felt by media outlets to portray matters like climate change as if they are debated matters, openly debated, and alternative facts are placed alongside the actual facts in the public discourse, and it's very difficult for observers to figure out what the truth is. Even the New York Times now has a climate change contrarian as one of its opinion writers, so this is really a problem when it comes to communicating the science to the public. Now, the basic science here, yes, there's uncertainty in climate science. There's uncertainty in all science. We're about as certain of the fact that humans are warming the planet and changing the climate by increasing greenhouse gas concentrations as we are about anything in science. Lawrence Krauss gave a wonderful presentation to start off the conference last night, where he talked about sort of the state of the art in our understanding of cosmology and neutron stars and black holes and gravitation. And indeed, if you listen to his presentation, you would say that Lawrence conceded that there are some uncertainties when it comes to gravity. But that doesn't make it safe to jump off a cliff, does it? And yet, when it comes to climate change, there are those who would have us jump off the metaphorical cliff of not acting in time because of scientific uncertainty. Well, I was moved by George's performance earlier this morning. Thoughts and prayers, right? Thoughts and prayers. When it comes to Superstorm Sandy or Sandy Hook, too often there are vested interests who want to do no more than express our thoughts and prayers, and it's the wrong time. It's the wrong time to talk about what was behind this problem, whether it's our lax gun laws or the lack of policy action on climate change. Indeed, Scott Pruitt accused scientists of politicizing matters by talking about the underlying reason that we are seeing more extreme weather, more intense hurricanes. That is precisely the time to be talking about these connections. But there are vested interests who want to poison the well and make sure that we can't talk about those connections when the public is actually listening. So let's talk about the connection that climate change has with some of what we have seen just this fall. Harvey, which hit Houston, the wettest event in U.S. history. Now, Gulf of Mexico sea surface temperatures were at all-time highs. One of the simplest laws in atmospheric physics, in fact, it isn't even atmospheric physics, it's thermodynamics. The warmer the ocean surface, the more moisture there is in the atmosphere. So those record warm temperatures meant that there were record levels of moisture available to produce record amounts of rainfall, and that's not a coincidence. Or Irma, the strongest hurricane as measured by peak winds ever in the open Atlantic. Now, there are those who will say that, maybe this is a coincidence. Maria talked eloquently earlier today about the phenomenon of luck, good luck and bad luck and statistics and probabilities. And yeah, maybe it's true that we have had strong hurricanes before. Well, this was the strongest storm ever in the open Atlantic. We do know, in fact, there's a very simple theoretical formalism for understanding the relationship between sea surface temperatures and hurricane strength. You can actually treat it as a Carnot cycle from physics. And the efficiency and the work that can be done by that effective engine is a function of the difference between the ocean surface temperature, the warm temperatures at the surface, and the cold temperatures aloft. And so when you increase those sea surface temperatures and you increase that difference, you increase the efficiency, you can do more work, you get faster winds. Empirically, we find that there's a roughly 10-mile-per-hour increase in peak winds for each 1 degree Fahrenheit warming of the ocean surface, and we've seen more than that amount of warming. Now, that's a roughly 7% increase in wind speeds. Now, 7% increase in wind speed of a Cat 5 storm, well, the destructive potential of the storm goes as the wind speed raised to the third power. So that 7% increase in wind speed is a 20% increase in destructive power. That's not a subtle signal. That's not a small signal. That's something that we see, and we are seeing it. Over the last 2 years, when global ocean surface temperatures have been at all-time highs, we've seen the strongest storm ever on Earth in recorded history. That was Patricia in the North Pacific 2 years ago. That was the strongest storm, obviously, in the Northern Hemisphere. The Southern Hemisphere saw its strongest storm ever, Winston. The Pacific obviously saw its strongest storm ever, and the open Atlantic has seen its strongest storm ever in the form of Irma. Now, maybe that's just bad luck, but the science would suggest otherwise. We're seeing the shifting of the odds in a profound way, and we're seeing the damage that has been wrought by that. So why should we care? It's not just about polar bears and penguins. I do care about polar bears and penguins. I want us to leave behind a world that has the same beauty and wonder for our children as the one we grew up in. But we are seeing fundamental impacts of climate change now in our daily lives. Extreme weather that is doing unprecedented levels of damage. It's no longer subtle. The impacts of climate change are no longer subtle. We are seeing them play out in real time. So there is this sort of denialism, and there are various stages of climate change denial that we see. Sort of the most fundamental form of that denial is the denial that anything's even happening, that the globe isn't warming. And it's sort of hard to abide that, given that we've seen now for the third straight year the warmest temperatures on record. 2014 was the warmest year on record till 2015, which was the warmest year on record till 2016, which was the warmest year on record. And again, maybe that's just chance, right? The critics will say, well, stovetop temperatures change all the time. Maybe it's natural. Maybe it's natural. Well, we actually decided to address that very question. Earlier this year, we published a study, and it used climate models and observations and Monte Carlo simulations to address the question, how likely is it that we would see 3 consecutive record-breaking years based on chance alone? Maria's talk earlier today, she talked about how you work out those sorts of probabilities and likelihoods. It turns out that global temperatures are correlated from year to year. If you have a big volcanic eruption, it's going to be cold for several years in a row. So you have to take that autocorrelation into account when you do the statistics. And so if you do it right, interestingly enough, you come up with a likelihood of 0.03%, which I think was the same percentage that Maria cited when she was talking about some very unlikely event. That is what we calculate the likelihood of that having happened due to chance alone. And I could walk you through the abstract, but fortunately Discover magazine expressed our conclusions in a way that even our president could understand. Well, the next sort of stage of denial then is, well, all right, but it's going to be self-correcting, right? Well, if you regard 200 feet of global sea level rise as self-correcting, then I suppose that's true. But if you accept that it's not self-correcting, then the next argument might be, well, okay, but it's a good thing, right? Melting ice sheets lift all boats. Well, we've seen the impacts of climate change. They are no longer subtle. Unprecedented flooding, unprecedented damage done by this series of record hurricanes in the Atlantic this year. And meanwhile, while all that has been happening in the East, as this title suggests, the American West is burning. This was an op-ed published in the Washington Post a month ago by a Republican senator from Montana. And in this article, this op-ed, The American West is Burning, the terms global warming and climate change never appeared. Well, folks, you can't solve a problem when you're unwilling to accept the underlying cause. Fortunately, Outside Magazine was more than happy to talk about why the West is burning, and indeed, extreme heat and ongoing drought. The drought in California, by the way, there was a brief respite last year because of a wet winter, but it's back in drought now. This is the worst drought on record for California, and when I say the worst drought on record, as far back as the paleoclimate scientists can go, at least 1,200 years back in time, this is the worst drought. Probably not a coincidence. Meanwhile, Syria has also seen its worst drought, and again, the paleoclimate scientists using tree rings can go back 900 years, and they say it's the worst drought that they've seen in that region in at least 900 years. Now, some dismiss climate change as a concern of, granola-chewing, environmentalists, but the national security community is actually quite concerned about climate change, which they view as a threat multiplier. Earlier this year, our president said something along the lines that we shouldn't be talking about issues like climate change, which are a distraction. We need to be focusing our energy, our attention on issues like global terrorism. Well, therein lies the deep fallacy, because that drought in Syria caused rural farmers to flood into the cities where they were competing with the people who were already there for food and water and space. And that conflict, that competition and conflict, created an atmosphere of instability in which ISIS was able to grow and flourish. And the national security community sees direct linkages between unprecedented extreme weather, unprecedented droughts, and the national security challenges that we face. Well, there has been this war on climate science, fought in many cases by front groups, organizations tied to fossil fuel interests who understandably are pretty happy with our addiction to fossil fuels. They don't want to see that change. And so they have fought tooth and nail to make sure that we don't transition away from fossil fuels towards renewable energy. And that war continues on. I have found myself at the center of it. Hypocrisy, thy name is climate change now. I told this story last year, but it's such a good story, I'm just going to tell it again. Ken Cuccinelli, or known as the Cooch, the former Attorney General of Virginia, Tea Party Republican, heavily funded, by the way, by fossil fuel interests. And when he became Attorney General, he tried to use what's known as a civil subpoena to seize all of my personal emails from the time I was a professor at the University of Virginia. Presumably, and much like what Kevin was talking about, to find something to discredit me with and to try to discredit the entire science of climate change as if it hinged on one person, let alone me. The Washington Post criticized his witch hunt, as they termed it, against me and the University of Virginia. At the time, I didn't know Tom Tolles, but he weighed into the matter not once, but twice. And I particularly am fond of this one, I have to say. I don't mind being compared to Galileo, I guess. So, turns out that his subpoena was quashed on a technicality. In his 40-page filing to the court, he had failed to provide evidence of wrongdoing on my part. And so the court threw it out. He appealed it to the state Supreme Court, which ultimately threw out the case with prejudice, meaning they never want an attorney general to come back to the court with something like that again. Well, Cuccinelli decided to run for governor in that next election. I actively campaigned with his opponent, Terry McAuliffe, who was victorious. I'll come back to that later. Ken Cuccinelli went off to work on an oyster farm on an island. I'm not making this up, folks. You can Google it. An oyster farm on an island, Tangier Island in the Chesapeake Bay, that is slowly succumbing to the effects of global sea level rise. You can't make this stuff up. You just can't make it up. So what do we do? What's the solution here? Well, some say it's geoengineering. We continue to burn fossil fuels and allow carbon to build up in the atmosphere, but we'll shoot things into the stratosphere to try to reflect solar radiation, shoot particles that will help reflect incoming radiation, or dump stuff into the oceans to try to fertilize the algae. And the list goes on. And there's a reason that the title of our chapter is Geoengineering, or What Could Possibly Go Wrong. We can imagine a number of things that could go wrong. Well, it turns out that our current Secretary of State, who coincidentally enough is the former CEO of the world's largest fossil fuel corporation, ExxonMobil, sees geoengineering as the solution. We keep on burning fossil fuels. We don't, move to renewable energy, but we'll shoot stuff into space, into the atmosphere. We'll dump stuff into the ocean. And hope that we get lucky and somehow magically offset the effect of global warming. Well, the principle of unintended consequences really reigns supreme with these schemes. So what's the real solution? What's the real path forward? Well, we've seen some remarkable progress in recent years. Every country but two signed on to the Paris Accord to make substantial reductions in their carbon emissions a couple years ago. The two countries that didn't sign on were Syria and Nicaragua. Nicaragua didn't think it went far enough. You may have read last week they finally did sign on. So that leaves only Syria and potentially the US, if Donald Trump does indeed make good on his threat to back out of the Paris Accord. And he has indeed staffed his administration with climate change deniers and fossil fuel lobbyists. The EPA administrator, Scott Pruitt, is engaged in an effort right now to dismantle all of the climate progress of the last administration and pretty much all of the environmental progress of the past half-century, progress that took place under both Republican and Democratic administrations. So it's an unprecedented assault on our environment. Just the other day, you may have read that Trump nominated a climate change denier to lead NASA. Now, I think that the title of this article is, is the wrong title. What it should be is the wrong stuff. The wrong stuff. That's what we're talking about. Somebody leading NASA who doesn't accept the basic science of climate change, the overwhelming consensus of the world's scientists. Well, what can we do to combat this? We have to speak out. We have to do everything we can to try to inform the public discourse over this issue, and I've been doing pretty much everything I can to try to communicate the reality and the threat of climate change in this tough environment that we find ourselves in. I was at the Washington, D.C. Science March, and people who saw this on television screens were asking themselves, who's that guy with Mike Mann? Of course, it was our good friend Bill Nye, who's been out on the front lines as well, communicating the reality and threat of this problem to the public. So let me come back to Terry McAuliffe, because when Trump withdrew from, or threatened to withdraw from the Paris Accord, the very first governor to say, we're still in, we don't care what Trump does, we're still in the Paris Accord, and we're going to do everything we can to meet our commitments under the Paris Accord. The very first governor was Terry McAuliffe of Virginia. Coincidences do happen. That wasn't a coincidence. So, we can't afford to lose this particular battle. The future of the planet as we know it literally is at stake. And so we have to fight for a science-informed public discourse, even in this tough environment that we find ourselves in today. And this is certainly an audience of people who can help us do that, who are on the front lines of fighting anti-science. We can always use help on Wikipedia, by the way. There's a lot of bad Wikipedia pages when it comes to climate change. So we can all play a role in trying to make sure that we don't allow the forces of anti-science to win out here, particularly with a problem that is as important as this is. Thank you.